Many of you will, I'm sure, know him. He's the Vice President of Poor Products at the Grameen Foundation. We are also very privileged to have Steve on our Industry and Standards Board, and he's been a friend and guide to Nexii's unrolling over the last nearly 4 years, I think, Steve. Before joining Grameen, Steve served for a number of years as the Director of Innovation and Technology at the Salesforce Foundation. And whilst there, established himself as a thought leader in social metrics with extensive experience working with Acumen Fund, the GIN, as Kate McMahon is here from the GIN today, and members of the Andy Network. He has a long history as a high school administrator and teacher and started his career in the Peace Corps. It was whilst teaching at school in 1990 that Steve became interested in the role that electronic communications could play in promoting and facilitating interactions between students in underserved communities and the rest of the world. Today, Steve's work is focused on microfinance institutions and other development organizations, helping them measure and manage their social performance using the progress out of poverty. Steve, it is fantastic to have you again present this, and I'm going to hand over to you now.
Great. Thank you very much, Tamsin. Greatly appreciate the interview, or the introduction, and let's just jump right in. So what I'm going to be talking about today is the PPI, which stands for the Progress Out of Poverty Index. I'm going to first of all talk a little bit about the context of social performance, talk about the PPI itself, and then show you some tools that we're building to help organizations to be able to implement the PPI and in order to have client-level poverty measurement inside of your organizations. Let's go ahead and get started. So, poverty measurement fits within the context of social performance. It's a name of a field within microfinance, but I think it's a really interesting way to talk about this work. So social performance is the effective translation of an institution's mission into practice in line with accepted social values. This definition comes from the Social Performance Task Force in microfinance. I personally sort of look forward to the day when we get to drop the adjective social from a lot of our work, and we can just simply talk about performance and all of the other things that we tend to put social in front of, or at the very least that we also start using financial as an adjective when that's explicitly what we mean. So the context of what we'll be talking about today is social performance, or this idea of how you build organizations that have integral to their design the measurement and management of the social mission, of the extent to which that organization intends to create a better world. I believe in the theory of change process. I believe in it in a very, very tactical and simple way. I think theory of change processes can get horribly blown out of proportion and really become a bit of a rabbit hole. I believe in them in a very simple way. And what you do with the theory of change is you begin by declaring the change that you intend to seek with the work that your organization does. For the Progress Out of Poverty Index, the change that we are looking for is organizations that intend to serve the poor make intent integral to their work. This is to a large extent at the center of a lot of the work that we're trying to do in social enterprise and any of the work that aims to leverage the physics of the market in order to create a better world. So what's our theory? The logic that ties our work to that change. First part of the theory, in order to increase efficiency, organizations must embed best practices into their operational workflow. And second, client-level poverty measurement data is necessary to provide evidence of success or failure of operational assumptions. So again, as you can see, that the work here is very, very tactical. We intend for this to be very practical. If you want to see this change happen, then you need to be able to do these things. What do we do? So what's the exact work of our theory of change? We make the Progress Out of Poverty Index a state-of-the-art client-level poverty measurement tool, and we provide interested users the necessary support products and services. So what is the PPI? So it's a country-specific, objective, client poverty measurement tool. Each PPI is built from a national household income and expenditure survey. We have close to 50 PPIs now, and what that means is that we essentially have close to 50 different products. Each PPI is totally different from the PPI next to it in that it's built from a different source survey, and it is a collection of 10 questions that are totally different from any of the others. It enables any organization to use client poverty assessments to manage social performance and to report both internally and externally on their outreach to the poor. We'll get more into that in a minute. It's expensive and efficient 10-question survey. It's comprised of simple, statistically sound indicators. The indicators tend to be verifiable, liable to change over time, and easy to answer. So very quickly, what we do is we take these household income and expenditure surveys. They're usually well over 100 different questions. These surveys are done by the statistics branches of the various governments that we work with. So we take these source surveys. These source surveys are what each country does to identify the poverty level in that country, as well as to calibrate their poverty level relative to the international poverty lines. Excuse me. These are those PPP lines, or purchasing power parity. They have shifted a bit recently, but there tends to be one right around $1, $1.25 a day, another around $2.50 a day, and another around $3.50 a day. PPP, purchasing power parity. And so then that's the one place where we're able to take what I mentioned are 40 some odd different products, but to take the results from those products and be able to compare them is when the results are compared against these international poverty lines. So what specifically does a scorecard look like? So here's the scorecard or the PPI for India. 10 verifiable questions that a field agent can ask their clients in 5 to 10 minutes. So each of these questions that you see here, does the family own a gas stove or gas range? That question comes directly out of the National Household Expenditure and Income Survey. These questions are not created by us. We choose these questions, as was mentioned in the previous slide, based on their ability to be verifiable. So a gas stove, you can see it. The survey is usually done in the home, though not always. Liable to change over time. Somebody could buy a gas stove, as opposed to somebody couldn't change their age. Age of household members is often an indicator of poverty. However, it's not a good indicator for the PPI because it's not liable to change. And easy to answer. And so we take these questions out of these, out of the national surveys, come up with a set of 10 that are uniquely predictive of poverty. So these 10 questions, when pulled together, are uniquely predictive of poverty. And then you get answers, or you get scores. So as you can see, the first question, how many household members are aged 0 to 17? Depending on which answer is chosen, a certain point value is assessed. Those point values are totaled between 0 and 100, in this case 29. You then take that point value and you find a score range on a lookup table. So the final score for each survey will tell the organization the likelihood that the survey respondent, the household of the survey respondent, is living below the national poverty line or one of the internationally recognized poverty lines. So if you look to the right of this table here, specifically for the national poverty line, a score of 29 you can see correlates to a 76.8% likelihood of being below the national poverty line. So we don't give a black and white score that just says yay or nay, they are below the poverty line. And that's because there is a true margin of error here, and exposing that margin of error helps the organization use this data effectively. Now that margin of error does go away when you're looking at aggregate scores. And so one of the classic uses of the PPI is to define the outreach for an entire organization. So let's say you go out and you administer the PPI to 300 or more of a well-selected random sample. You can then say, based on that sample, that your organization has, let's say, 60% of their clients below the national poverty line. Whereas you can't point at any one household with certitude and say that household is definitively below the poverty line. You can aggregate those numbers in order to remove that margin of error. So what do you do with PPI data? So with PPI data, you can do essentially 3 different types of things. The first one is client targeting and market intelligence. So you can use the PPI to find out who and where the poor are. This is targeting. It's important to note relative to targeting that margin of error, those margin of error that I just mentioned. And so whenever you use the PPI for targeting, you're also adding your own programmatic data to the mix. And so it may be that you find that you have a goal as an organization to have, let's say, 60% of your clients below the national poverty line. When you find a household that is 70, 60, 40% likelihood of being below that national poverty line according to the PPI, then you're going to apply other filters based on your organization that have to do with their appropriateness for your products. So again, it's not an absolute tool, but it is a valuable piece of data in the process. It'll also let you understand the demographics and the locations of the poor. So if you're looking to open to a new market, a new region, you can go out and do a PPI survey and understand whether or not that region has the clients that you're looking for. And that's one of the critical pieces of this, is it should really be thought of as business intelligence. The PPI is not a tool that, it's often thought of as the PPI as a tool to prove that you're alleviating poverty. It's not that, or at least it's not any more than a ruler is a tool that can prove that somebody grows. It's simply measurement. And what you as your organization do with that measurement, your purpose for doing that measurement, is what will drive your use of the product. So first of all, demographics of the poor. Where are the poor? How many poor women are in my database? These sorts of things. The second category is performance management. And so this is when you're taking PPI data, your assumptions about the products that you're building that you intend to serve the poor, with which you intend to serve the poor. And so now you can ask questions like, are my products and services being consumed by the poor? An absolutely critical question that in many cases is very, very difficult to answer. If you are building a product that is explicitly for poverty alleviation and you do not know whether or not the people who are consuming your product are statistically poor, then you're missing a critical piece of business intelligence to run your organization. Are my employees, my branch offices serving the poor? Adding customer satisfaction to these things, you can start to slice and dice this information to say, do people at different poverty levels like my product? And then finally, measuring clients' movement relative to poverty. So are my clients becoming more or less poor over time? So let's dive into a handful of very specific examples of people who have used PPI data for varying purposes. So this is the one that I just mentioned, poverty over time. What you see here are 2 different PPI survey data points that are separated by approximately a year. In this case, this is Grameen KOOTA in India. They were able to demonstrate movement. So what you're seeing here is a a group of the same people, so they controlled for what we call dropouts. So anybody who was not in the second sample was also removed from the first sample. It's a critical aspect of doing progress over time or longitudinal data, is that you make sure that it's relevant to just generically measure all of your clients each year, but what the answer you get is totally different. If you're just simply measuring and not paying attention to dropouts, what you're getting is how is your poverty outreach changing over time as an organization. In this scenario, they wanted to know how are the poverty levels of our clients changing over time. And it's a very different question from a design perspective. And you can see that in each instance, in the first graph, you see various poverty lines. The second graph, you see something very interesting, which is these are the groupings of the raw PPI scores, so before they're correlated to the lookup table, and you can see each point moving over a little bit. It was very interesting for this organization to understand where the peaks were on both of these, how that peak flattened out in the second one, where the inflection point is. These sorts of questions are very interesting and allow them to get even more granular as they do the PPI in the future. And then you can take this exact same data and cut it in different ways. So in this case, they did urban versus rural. So how has poverty changed relative to different poverty lines for our urban versus rural clients? This could be done for gender. This could be done for type of business, any number of different things by specific product. This organization has a cook stove and a solar panel, and they did the same data based on consumption of those products. So as you can see, once again, you can get some very interesting data about how your customers are reacting to your products, how the customers that are consuming your products are faring. Better question. So here's another example. This is an organization called PT Rumah. They're based in Jakarta and work throughout. Their business model is to provide a cell phone with a simple application on that cell phone to usually these women who run small kiosk shops throughout Indonesia. And what they do is they sell minutes on any of, I believe, 11 different cell phone networks. So when somebody comes to their kiosk, they're able to bring their cell phone with them and purchase a small amount of minutes to then be used on their phone. So these, it's a micro-entrepreneur business model. When they set up this business model, they wrote into their charter as part of their legal definition that 80% of all of their customers must be below the $2.50 a day PPP, poverty line. After their first year of operations, whenever somebody goes to use the phone, they get the PPI. So the PPI is embedded into their telephone application. So they have this data directly into their MIS system. After the first year, they saw they had a 64% outreach relative to that poverty line. So what did they do? They knew they had to get to 80. Well, the first thing they did was they created a more effective targeting and screening process. So the front door of recruiting and accepting new entrepreneurs, they tweaked to ensure that they could deepen their poverty outreach. The other thing they did is they found out that while the people below that poverty line were exactly as good statistically at running the business as people above that poverty line, and they have a broad mix, they found that the poor were dropping out within the first 3 months. So they believe the reason for those dropouts had to do with shocks, with financial shocks to their households. And so they have provided them with things like insurance and savings accounts and some other ameliorations to try and keep people in the system for that critical first 3 months. FONKOZE has done some wonderful work with the PPI. The thing that's interesting about what they've done is they've taken the PPI and used it to understand the efficacy of shorter-term specific disaster relief loan programs. So they had the unfortunate distinction of having two serious disasters back-to-back, first the hurricane and then the earthquake. First of all, what they did was they developed a really fine-tuned and excellent targeting process where they used the PPI, what's called poverty scorecard results here. They also used a food security survey that is put out by Freedom from Hunger. And then they also did client focus groups, otherwise known as participatory wealth ranking. And they used these various targeting mechanisms to ensure that they got the right mix of clients for this program. They also used them to understand whether or not these people's poverty is changing in a relatively short amount of time. It needs to be said that the PPI is sensitive to change, but it's sensitive to larger change. Things like client focus groups can be better at assessing shorter-term change. So the point being is that they applied this to the hurricane program. They found that they were able to at least level, if not improve, the quality of life of the people that were involved in that program relative to those that were not, or more specifically relative to those that were not impacted by the hurricane. They were able to take that same methodology and reapply it during the earthquake, and now they believe they have a very sound methodology for providing economic interventions to people impacted by disasters, which was a very exciting result for us. This is one of my favorite case studies because it really shows how the PPI can be used to define a specific product or to design and tweak a specific product. So Card Bank or Card MRI, Mutually Reinforcing Institutions in the Philippines, is a group of institutions all focused on using the market and financial services to improve the lives of the poor. They have been offering savings products for over 10 years. But they've been offering them generally in a compulsory manner, meaning that they're tied directly to their credit. They had tried voluntary savings in a number of different incarnations, but had never been success in getting uptake from various poverty levels. They'd always assumed that was because the poor didn't want to save. We went in with them and did, using the PPI, to identify the poverty lines and the populations that are below those lines. We went in with them and looked at the data, and what we found was that there was no correlation between poverty level and a willingness to save. However, there did seem to be a strong correlation between willingness to save and location of place to take a deposit, as well as the initial requirement for the balance in the initial deposit. So Card dramatically lowered the initial balance, as well as allowed deposit taking inside of their microfinance program. So basically using inside the villages took savings deposits, and now they've dramatically improved the uptake of this program to the point where many of their credit customers are now savings-only customers. We're finding just really exciting things happening around savings in general as being an initial catalytic economic intervention for the poor. The great difficulty there in the microfinance space is that MFIs have not traditionally offered savings because, very specifically because they're regulated out of providing savings. And so that leaves them with only credit as the only economic product that financial services product they can provide. Here's another really interesting example. So this is Good World Solutions produces a product called LaborLink. What they do is they go into factories or working environments of people inside of the developing world. So they'll work for a corporation who is interested in understanding how poverty is playing out, often in their outsourced environments, or if they are, say, located in India, in their factory environments. The bubble graph towards the bottom that you're seeing there, the farther left is the lower or the deeper poor scores than the farther right, and additionally the size of the bubble correlates to length of employment, how long, in this case, this woman has been employed at that factory. What you're looking for is small bubbles to the left, large bubbles to the right. in the hope in an effort to support a theory that says if you can get a job at this factory and work here over time, you will be able to save and become less poor. So these are exactly the sorts of things in my mind that we want to start being able to do with outsourcing scenarios. There is no reason why a good job in a factory in the developing world shouldn't be an outstanding intervention against poverty. We just need to shift the conversation and obviously the practices. In that context, the PPI is a very powerful tool to help us understand and to help these corporations start to take positive ownership of this externality. Oikocredit is a wonderful partner of ours, has been for many years. They were with us from the very beginning, helping us to ensure that poverty measurement in the PPI is effective in the microfinance context. They do some really wonderful things around providing preferential loans if people use the PPI effectively, because they get more visibility into the efficacy of their own dollars, their own investment dollars, relative to poverty. And they've also invested aggressively in ensuring that their investees are well-trained and using the PPI effectively. For those of you who know the GIN, Global Impact Investment Network, and the IRIS standards, I am a huge fan of the IRIS standard. What it does for us is it gives us the opportunity to compare to each other. This is the most important thing that IRIS does, is its definition of common metrics. There is no problem that any of us in the social space, no problem that any of us are focused on that we can solve alone. It is incumbent upon all of us to take that deeply into our practice. If we are not collaborating effectively across organizations with similar interventions, then we will fail. We won't get where we need to go. This is we must work together to solve things like hunger, disease, poverty. What IRIS gives us is a platform for that collaboration. At the very least, with IRIS, if we are defining what we collect in the same manner, then we can begin to understand if the needle is moving. So we have, the PPI is now in IRIS. In a very basic sense, it just gives you a definition or a methodology for saying, I have very poor or poor or low income clients at this percentage. And it allows you to have a common definition of exactly what low income means, so that when you're comparing it to somebody else, that it makes sense. Quick slide, a little bit more about our customers and who they are. The PPI is in 70% of the countries where the world's poor live, covering about 88% of the poor. We have actually, should have updated this, about 170 organizations now. And in the neighborhood of 70% of all of our users at the moment are MFIs, but by far the fastest growing group are the non-MFIs. So what I want to show you now is a quick demo of a tool that we are building. We're just now entering the beta phase. If you're interested, please contact me. That lowers the barrier to entry for the PPI. So we know that the PPI, first and foremost, was created in order to make it more simple to measure poverty. We definitely achieved that goal. However, there are other barriers to entry. Primarily, the one that we hear most frequently is the IT context, and that for the PPI to be useful as business intelligence, it's critical that it be integrated into an organization's operational infrastructure so that they can correlate the responses to the PPI to other variables that are important to advancing the mission of the business. So what we've built is an environment that allows an organization to pull this data directly into an IT context. It also really facilitates the process of building data collection surveys and pushing those out via mobile phone. So let's take a quick look here. Let's look at this one called Vitamin Feedback and Poverty Scorecard. Just do a quick preview of it here. So here is a basic survey. So we begin with some client information. We move on to a very simple customer satisfaction series of questions. And then finally we have the actual PPI itself. In this case, this is the PPI for Indonesia. And as you see, each question correlates to a score. Those scores are totaled. So given that this is what a survey looks like, let's run real quickly into a draft survey. And I'll hit edit so you can see the edit environment. So you have some basic definition. Right now, everything is smartphone. We will be adding Java and SMS. Here's the question builder. When you go into building questions, you have the same environment that you just saw, but now you see you have the capacity and you have the capacity to sort of move those questions about on the page. Again, there's the scoring environment. We also have skip logic. So on any one question, I can, if I go in and hit edit, I can add a condition that says if the answer to question 2 is no, then don't show this or do show this. And so that's the skip logic. It allows you to show one, to have conditional values. And then we have field mapping. And so if this survey is something that is very specific to things like inventory, or it's a survey that you give regularly, you can build database objects so that this data will drop directly into a very specific database object. And so you can do things like inventory management with this. So that's what the surveys look like in general. Let me quickly jump over to a cell phone emulator. So this is an Android cell phone emulator. I'm going to jump into the application here. We're upgrading this interface to a prettier one. So here are all of those different PPIs that we looked at a minute ago. Let's grab the Philippines PPI. I'm going to hit Get Selected. So I needed to be online to do that, to pull the PPI down from the main server. I do not need to be online to fill out the survey, so I could be totally offline now, and that would be fine. It will collect the GPS coordinates of the survey. So as you can see, the record location there. So this is to do an integration into your backend database. It will record the GPS location. It won't on this emulator, so I'm not going to worry about it. And then you have your various PPI questions that you can ask. And let's go ahead and answer each of those. I can do these on separate screens. This depends on the type of phone that you're provisioning to. You can do these questions each on its own screen, or you can set them all to be one screen. Usually with smartphones, it's better to set them all to be the same screen. So I go through each of these questions. This is the Philippines PPI. Does a household own a motorcycle? Does a household own a television? So these, again, are questions that were derived from the national survey for the Philippines as being uniquely predictive of poverty. I go ahead and save that form. Now, all of this I could have been entirely offline for, but now I'm going to hit Send Finalized Form, Philippines PPI, Send Selected. So that form was sent back to the survey. So now I'm moving from being somebody out in the field administering a form, and I'm going to come back to the administration interface, find the Philippines PPI, and I can click response count here. And these are the very specific. You can see I did mine on the desktop, but people who did it with their cell phones, the GPS location was automatically recorded. Very powerful for mapping mashups and those sorts of things, to have that locational data as well right inside your database. And then finally, one of the most important aspects of this intervention is that we're giving the organization very powerful analytics that can happen almost automatically with very little setup. You can do deeper analytics with a little more work. But basically, as we mentioned, the poverty outreach, like what's in IRIS, you set up a report that just tells you, that aggregates across everybody who's taken a PPI in your database, and it tells you what are your percentages of poverty outreach. You can also spread that poverty outreach across a histogram so you can understand where you are deep. You take this same data and cut it by regions. You can understand in which regions does do the poor exist. It helps you understand how desperately the people who work for your organization, how desperately important they are. Many organizations have far deeper poverty outreach in certain regions. The people that work in those regions need to be particularly good at dealing with the very poor, because we know that interventions are different based on poverty level. So again, this is very, very important business intelligence for these kinds of businesses. Now you're looking at price by region. So this is a customer satisfaction survey. Here's another one that is taste by region. The use case here is a nutritional supplement. So imagine also having poverty buckets against these various questions. So I will stop there with about 15 minutes left, and ask for any questions that we might have.
Great, thanks, Steve. I see one of the questions that we have so far, and just to remind everybody, if you do have questions, if you look at the View button in your top toolbar, you will have a place where it says Questions, and you can add your questions in there. But the question here is PPI only valid for microfinance organizations, or does it apply to other social enterprises? And if so, which kinds?
So it's a great question. There is absolutely nothing in the design, structure, methodology of the PPI that is explicit to any business model. It just so happens that microfinance is the first business model in which we implemented the PPI. As I mentioned, we have growing numbers of non-microfinance organizations. Right now we're in the neighborhood of 70% of our organizations are MFIs, but through our relationships with organizations like Nexii and Aspen Network for Development Entrepreneurs and others, we have a dramatically growing interest. We are doing some basic level research with a grant from the Ford Foundation to understand what is different about the social enterprise context. What we know right now is a couple things. So in microfinance, in general, the PPI is administered in the home of the poor client. In social enterprise, that environment is often not as accessible. So one of the things we're doing is a study to understand exactly what is the difference from a statistical point of view. We have many organizations who today are doing it outside of the home. There are some specific things that we know, but in general, we're finding that there is not a major statistical difference between in the home and outside of the home. The major issue there is can you verify the data? So when the question is something like what is your roof made out of, an enumerator can easily look at the roof. If you're not in the home, then you have a little bit more of a trust issue. What we found to date is that it's less about whether or not the client is telling the truth than it is about whether or not the client actually knows the right answer. So, for instance, in Kenya, one of the questions is how many frying pans do you own? Which seems like a strange question, but it is indeed uniquely predictive of poverty in that region. The problem is that we found that it may be that some people don't, men in particular, know how many frying pans are owned by their household. And so they may give an inaccurate answer. The one other variable there is the difference between census and sample. So again, in microfinance, generally it's the best practice to do census, so meaning that every single one of your customers get the PPI, and that's entirely doable because on loan origination and renewal, the loan officer goes to the home of the person receiving that loan. And so in that context, they administer the PPI, because as I mentioned earlier, it takes 5 or 10 minutes max. That same touch point doesn't exist for social enterprises. So many social enterprises do a sample, which means that they go out and find a representative number of clients to test. There's a couple different issues with samples that are difficult. Primarily is understanding progress over time, so finding the same people each year to give the survey to. So that's where we are with that one right now.
Great. And Steve, just another question here is on the smartphone app. How does that work in terms of general access for investors or interested parties? And, you know, who will specifically be able to use that?
Okay, so it will be a product in the market, and so anybody will be able to use it. In the investor context, it's interesting. So we're understanding that there are really two very distinct use cases. So one is what a social enterprise or MFI might do with that smartphone app, which is specifically to enable their employees to hold and use these phones in the field to run any type of different survey that may or may not include the PPI. So that's a clear use case that we understand. The other one that's emerging is something that is more project-based. So it may very well be that an investor says, what we need to know is the poverty outreach of our portfolio, or the poverty outreach of a particular intervention in poverty in a region. So we have these 6 investments in Kenya. We need to know the poverty outreach of these specific organizations. In that context, what we're building in very particular regions are partners, and in some cases our own businesses, where that investor could hire a company to go out and do the enumeration for them. So the smartphone app itself would never sort of enter the building of the investor. They would simply be paying for somebody to go out and do the survey and provide the reports.
That's a great question.
The investor, of course, if they wanted to, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, no, carry on.
I was just going to say, if the investor wanted to engage in the process of actually doing the survey enumeration, they of course could. The application will be generally available in the market.
Right. And a great question from Vivina is, what happens to the findings? Are they proprietary to clients, or do they get published for general use so that others can benefit from them?
It's that slippery center space between the two. So the data is, of course, owned by the organizations. The organization needs to understand that they own the data completely, but we are providing a very, very simple and transparent and secure way to anonymize and send that data to us, so that we can gain these learnings. One of the things we're looking at is the potential of a free version of the application that is really focused on PPI data collection, and in those contexts, we would likely require sharing of the data.
And Steve, I know that there's been a comparative study of the PPI relative to the PAT, the Poverty Assessment Tool. Has there been any comparative with other frameworks like the SROI or GEARS or any of those? And how does PPI sit to those frameworks when people are making a decision about which way to go?
Yeah, so the PPI and the PAT are important to compare and to a certain extent decide between, because they largely do the same thing. This is client-level poverty measurement. The other tools that are out there, there are many in terms of putting together your sort of M&E arsenal. I actually prefer, as I mentioned earlier, the framework of business intelligence as opposed to M&E. I think it is important for social enterprises I actually consider MFIs to be social enterprises. So I think it's important for social enterprises to not take on too much burden relative to this sort of mythical understanding of impact. What social enterprises need to do is run lean and effective businesses that serve the poor or advance their mission. And that's really the end of the story. When we burden these organizations with impact generation or proving impact, these sorts of things, we're actually decreasing, I believe, their ability to deliver their services by diverting resources. So that's my soapbox on that particular issue, but the point being there are many other ways to gain important business intelligence. There aren't other poverty, client-level poverty measurement tools. There are other ways to assess your poverty outreach, but not at the client level. I do think it's critical to bring in-house any of the tools that you need to run your business. If you're in ag or fair trade, there's Casita. There's a number of other indicators that organizations should be using, but I see many of them as, most of them as complementary.
That's great. So the other question that came up was, is the living standards measure similar to PPI?
I'm not sure which living standards measure. There's one that comes out of Oxford, the Multidimensional Poverty Index, which I'm actually quite excited about. I'm eager to try and build that into our mobile tools. I mentioned earlier the poverty wealth ranking and some of these other things. Anything that can be easily built into these tools that can provide this powerful sort of operational business intelligence data, we're eager to work with them. So if I'm missing one, I'd love to know about it.
Okay. So I think that's it for questions, unless anybody else has a burning question, follow on from that. If you want to raise your hand, we'll make a questions page. Otherwise, Steve, it's fantastic. Thank you. And I'm sure everybody learned a lot. And we look forward to the smartphone app, which I see Oiko Credit has just tweeted about.
Oh, outstanding.
Yeah. So great, everybody. Thanks for joining, and look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Steve, thank you hugely from all of us at Nexii and everybody else.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, Tamsin, and thank you, everyone, for taking some time out of your day.
Thanks, Steve. Bye-bye, everyone.
All right. Bye-bye.